Hello everyone, this is Namrata. Hope you all are doing good and staying safe. Today we'll be covering another important topic in Salesforce, which is single sign-on implementation. Here is the agenda for today's session. We will be covering what is single sign-on, advantages of single sign-on, what is a prerequisite before you enable the single sign-on in your Salesforce org, what is inbound and outbound single sign-on, how do you enable single sign-on, followed by our demo. We'll try to split this into two sessions. Session 1, we will be covering the entire theory, and session 2 will get into the real demo. So let's understand what is single sign-on. Single sign-on enable users to access various applications with single login and the password. So basically the single sign-on is an authentication method. Once any user login into your network or an organization, they can automatically access all the other applications. Suppose, for example, you are into your company org. You have a username and password, right? So that specific username can be used to access all other applications across the network. The advantages of single sign-on is you spend less time managing the password because the same or whatever username that is being configured, it can be used to access all other applications automatically. With the implementation of the single sign-on, it is mainly used for the authentication, right? Which means you are increasing the security. Your employees save a lot of time when they don't have to manually log in into the Salesforce, because if there are different orgs in your Salesforce, like you have Salesforce production one instance, you have another production different instances, rather than entering the username and password, um, it they will just use they will just try to log in into the Salesforce with a single username. So that saves a lot of the employees or your users time. So these are the advantages of implementing the single sign-on. So in order to implement the single sign-on, that is when you try to implement the single sign-on, you need to establish the trust between the two systems. This trust is based on a certificate, that is an exchange between the identity provider and the service provider. So now let us try to understand these terms, like what is an identity provider and the service provider. The system that authenticates the users is called as an identity provider, and the system that trusts the identity provider for the authentication is called as a service provider. Here is the pictorial representation of what we are actually talking about. So in this example, Salesforce is treated as the service provider, and the Axiom Heroku application that we are going to use, it is called as an identity provider. That is, this Axiom Heroku application, it authenticates the user, whereas the Salesforce is something which trusts the identity provider for the authentication. We can configure the Salesforce as an identity provider. You can also configure the Salesforce as a service provider, which is something which we are going to discuss today. And we can also configure the Salesforce as the SP or the IP. So here, whatever we are using is the Axiom Heroku web application. It is called as an identity provider, which is mainly used for the single sign-on testing. Let's get into and understand what is the prerequisite for single sign-on. Whenever you enable the single sign-on, you have to ensure that my domain is already configured. So my domain, this is something which we have configured when we had a session related to the Experience Cloud. So you have to go to the sites, you have to register a domain. That specific domain is a prerequisite in order to implement the single sign-on. So I will try to show you that as well in our demo. Now let us try to understand what is an inbound and the outbound single sign-on. So inbound single sign-on is users log in somewhere else, like an on-premise application, that is your org or your network. Then from that specific org or the network, they will be able to access the Salesforce without logging in. That is inbound single sign-on. So in our today's session, we will be covering the inbound single sign-on. What is an outbound single sign-on? Outbound single sign-on is users log in into the Salesforce, and then from when they log in into the Salesforce, they can access the other services without logging in again. So if you have different applications with the same whatever you configure in the Salesforce, like a federation ID or the unique username, with that specific identity, you will be able to log in into the other services without logging in again with the username and the password. So how do you configure the single sign-on, or how do you enable the single sign-on? First, you have to ensure that you are enabling the single sign-on. That is something which I will be showing you in some time. Uh, and as a step one, what you have to do is, for whatever the user, you have to ensure that you are creating a federation ID for that specific user. So the federation ID is something which is very important. On the user settings, you will be able to find the federation ID. You will have to create that federation ID. Once that is a step one, once that is done, you will have to ensure that you set up your SSO provider in the Salesforce. You provide all the details about your identity provider in the Salesforce. Once that is done, what are you gonna do? You are gonna link your identity provider to the Salesforce, and then we will verify how does the entire process works. Whatever the configuration that we have done, how does it works? That is the end-to-end implementation, whether it is working fine or not. So that is something which we will be covering. All of this is something which we will cover in our demo. So let's try to understand what is a federation ID. Federation ID, that is a step one, right? You have to create a federation ID. Federation ID is a unique attribute to identify each specific user. Suppose you have 50 users, so 50 users will have a unique attribute to identify each of those users. So that is something which you have to do it as a part of the specific process. So how do you create a federation ID? As I mentioned, you go to the users, and when you try to edit the user's name under single sign-on information, you will be able to see the federation ID. So federation ID can be unique. You can make sure that you create a unique identity reference for that specific user. Once you create a federation ID, the step two is you will have to work with your SSO provider in the Salesforce. So here what we are going to do, work with your identity provider to gather the SAML informations and the assertion parameters. So what is SAML? SAML is Security Assertion Markup Language, which is mainly used to authentication and the authorization. So it is a open standard authentication protocol, which is mainly used for both the authentication and the authorization. So you will have to collect or work with that specific identity provider. In our case, we are using the identity provider as the Axiom Heroku web application. You have to work with that specific identity provider, get all the information and update in the Salesforce. So that is what is the second point. Gather the information from your identity provider before configuring the Salesforce for the SAML. So that is the step two. What are all the parameters that you have to do? So here we will be using the Axiom Heroku web application. Here we are just walking you through on the steps that you need to follow as soon as you open this application. How do you gather it? We will be downloading the identity provider certificate. Once you download the identity provider certificate and save it in your desktop, then you try to enable the single sign-on. Here, all these steps are being mentioned over here. Single sign-on. And once you enable the single sign-on, these and all are the details that you will have to enter. What is the name of the application, web application we will be using here? Axiom test app. What is the issuer? Issuer is the unique URL that identifies your identity provider in the SAML session sent to the Salesforce. So that is something, all of these details has to be provided by our identity provider. Then whatever the certificate that we will be downloading, we will be using it over here, and rest all follows. I will walk you through each of these details when we get into our demo. Once you fill in all of these information, you save the information. So that is the step two. You created a federation ID. You set up your service provider, that is single sign-on provider in the Salesforce by gathering the information from your identity provider. That is the step two. As a step three, what you have to do is you have to link your identity provider to the Salesforce. So these are the different values that you will have to enter in the Heroku web application web app. I will walk you through each of these details when we get into the demo. And once you link your identity provider to the Salesforce, then you will have to verify whether you are able to log in from the Heroku application, that is Axiom Heroku web app, whether you are able to log in into your Salesforce or not. So this is how you verify you are able to log in into the different application into your Salesforce using the unique identification, that is the federation ID that you have configured in the Salesforce. So that is once we have the federation ID generated or created for any user using that specific generation federation ID, you will be able to access the other applications automatically. So that is what we have for today's session. So I hope you are able to understand the theory or the concepts of what is single sign-on, how do you enable the single sign-on and the purpose of the single sign-on. In our session 2, we will get into the details about each, whatever the 4 steps that we have defined. We will get into each of those 4 steps in detail. Until then, please do take care of yourself. Signing off, Namrata Kalyani. Bye-bye.